It was truly small-town Vermont. When I was a kid, I always thought it was a great town to grow up in.
I think many of the same things that families enjoy about Waterbury today were true back then, just in a different way. There was a real sense of community.
It was a close-knit, well-balanced, community that had a lot to offer.
I would say back when I was growing up, things were very, very good in Waterbury and Waterbury Center. It was a nice time to live.
Well, you knew everybody. One thing, if you didn't know them, you wanted to know them.
Waterbury's always been important to me. It's even when I was a kid, the people here seemed real and good. It's changed so much. When I was growing up, I think there was 6 or 8 farms on this hill, just Loomis Hill.
Since being chartered in 1763, the town of Waterbury has undergone many changes. Its history is as deep and fertile as the soil that continues to be tilled on remaining farms in the area. The stories and memories shared in this oral history provide a peek into the past and offer a view of what life was like nearly a century ago. Like many small towns in Vermont, the residents of Waterbury have always been known for their self-reliance, Yankee ingenuity, and most importantly, their strong sense of community and compassion.
One time my father lost his horse and he didn't know what he was going to do to draw his machinery. It was the Christmas time. The teacher would have a gift for all the children, and then we children swapped some gifts. Anyway, the last gift on the tree was a little box about the size of a matchbox and wrapped up, and they brought it to my mother and father. They were sitting in there, and they said, "What's this?" And they opened it up, and it was full of money. Oh my gosh, they just cried. So they had enough money to buy another horse. And that is how neighbors were.
My grandfather came to Waterbury first in 1895, and he sold automobiles very early on. It would have been, 1910. In those days, you could barter for things that you needed. And some gentleman brought him in a bunch of hardware. And when he was pondering what to do with this supply of hardware he had, the garage in which he stored the vehicles caught fire one night. And all those cars in those days were soft top cars. All the tops burned off. So he lost a whole bunch of cars, but he had this hardware. So he decided, well, I can always sell hardware. And that's where the business took off. And we were there really up until the late 70s.
I mean, people were really self-sufficient in those days, and my grandfather was. He could do anything.
My grandparents farmed on top of Ricker Mountain from the late 1800s into 1921. My grandmother had 3 daughters, and the middle one, it did a damage to her, and she had to be sewed up, and my grandfather actually used the horsehair off the violin bow to actually do that.
Waterbury has no shortage of powerful stories. In the early years, Waterbury was dotted with hillside farms, and just about everyone who lived outside the village had a self-sustaining farm, growing vegetables and milking a few cows. Whether you lived on a farm or not, eking out a living during the late 1800s and early 1900s meant you had to be frugal and self-sufficient. There was always work to get done, and everyone pitched in.
I was, of course, growing up during the Depression. We didn't know it was a Depression, but we always had food on the table because we were on the farm. And it was always milk and vegetables. And we had a good life on the farm.
As I grew up in Waterbury Center, everybody had some kind of critters of some sort. In my family, I guess we were what you'd call green today or whatever. We produced about everything we ate on the farm, and we eat it with wood, of course, and my mother never threw a dipper of stuff away out of raising 5 kids.
As kids wore hand-me-down clothes, my mother patched them, and you got along with what you had, and that's the way it was. And you were happy to have something in your belly at night and clothes on your back and a warm place to sleep. And it probably seems simple, but at my age today, I still feel pretty grateful about that.
My father, being a frugal farmer, he raised three boys to work on a farm. That's what we're there for. Our farm was here on Blush Hill, and in the summertime, my father always had to have extra pasture for his young stock. And the pasture he was using was on Barnes Hill in Waterbury Center, which was 4 miles from the farm here. The way we got them up there was we put them in the road and drive them. I know I was about 6 years old when we started doing that, and the kids' job, like mine, was to be along to keep them from going into different driveways. And it was quite a little hike especially for us kids.
Life was pretty tough. I mean, everybody started work. I had my first paper at 7, me and my brother. We peddled 35 papers a day, each one of us, and we started at, like 5:30 in the morning. We had chores to do it. You got home from school and you took off your best clothes and put on such as they were, and put on what was the farm clothes, and everybody that was lugging the wood and lug the kerosene or feed the cows or pick up the eggs or whatever. There was something before you got to play, and I mean just as youngsters.
I remember at 8 or 9 years old milking cows, so I had 4 or 5 cows I had to milk. And we milked by hand at that time. I have to do it, of course, in the morning before school and go to school almost immediately afterwards. Of course, there's no showers, nothing like that back then. So I know that we went to school smelling pretty barny a lot of the time.
No, we never went anywhere. We never went anywhere, so we were here all the time. My older brother, who was about 6 years older than me, when he was 12, he was baling hay for a neighbor down here. He would drive the tractor and bale the hay. I didn't have that. We were still haying when I was about 8 or 9, and I'd drive the tractor out here picking up hay and stuff, but I didn't get to do baling like he did.
Very, very rare we made it downtown. My mother cut our hair, all the boys with a bowl like you see on TV. That's no joke, down over your head, and you look like a girl when you're done, but that was the way it was. Women didn't get the recognition, but they worked as hard then. I mean, my mother, the way she did dishes and had a big garden.
I was a stay-at-home girl. I did the work. My husband earned the money. We butchered a cow every year. We had a pig. We had chickens, eggs, all our milk, cream. What more do you want?
And I'd help with the milking. Lots of times I'd help with the milking, and after supper, if my father said, I need some extra help tonight, I'd say, I'll go, Dad, I'll go. I'd rather do that than do dishes.
Of course, all the milk got shipped in cans, and it was before bulk tanks and pipelines and all that. People really had to work to get the milk, I mean.
My father planted corn and beans. We loved it, but it was hard work. So being the oldest, I used to help ride the horse when my father used a cedar planting behind me. And you'd ride that horse all day long, and you'd get kind of lazy sometimes, and you start wee-wawing, and your father would yell at you, go straight. I said, I'm trying to. It's getting sore here. When we took baths when I was a little kid, the water was all drawn from the well in pails, and you'd carry it into the house and warm it in the warming oven of the stove, and then you'd dip it out of there, and we'd each take our bath near the kitchen stove where it was warm.
Sunday night, all the lights would go out. You didn't even walk down the stairs if your sister had a slip on. My mother would have washed your mouth out with soap. I mean, everything was a lot less open than it is today. I'm not sure if that was good or bad, but my dad would heat the hot water on the stove and put it in that tub, and there were 5 of us. The oldest guy got to go first. Out of 5 kids, I was the last child to take a bath. That was the only bath of the week. We sponge bathed along the way, but it was usually in cool water. And the tub was not very nice by the time that it got to be my turn.
As I grew a little older, my folks would send me to the store that way. I'd go into the store with my little list of groceries, not too big a list, but things they needed, and they'd put them on a bill. They did that in those days. They put their list of things on the bill, and when my father came in later on, he'd pay the bill.
The store up there, Mr. Slack, was good to my father, and he charged all winter. And then all summer, he'd work 6, 7 days a week to get that bill down, and by then winter'd come.
The village was always busy as the hub for Waterbury businesses. Besides the storefronts dotting Main Street and Stowe Street, there was a surprising number of granite sheds, creameries, manufacturing companies, and lumber mills.
I grew up in the village. I spent a lot of my childhood down at the feed store. My brother ran the store for my dad, and all the local kids went down there, and it was a local hangout. We rode the feed trucks out to the farmers, and we raised calves there in the spring. Some farmer would give us a calf, and we'd have the calf in the office at the feed store. And
one thing I remember about growing up there is we had a big front porch that went across the front of that house. It's a red brick house, and I think H&R Block is in there now. I can remember sitting on the porch when there was no interstate and Route 2 went right through the town, and cars, of course, would come from everywhere. So we would collect out-of-state license plates and have a little contest to see who could get the most out-of-state license plates.
I lived all my life here, and you know, even back in those days, growing up on the north end, you seemed like that was your area of play and familiarity. You know, being close to the pool, that was a big summertime thing.
I was born in '55. You know, my grandfather ran the undertaking business here and the furniture store. There was, you know, Bailey's department store up the road. I mean, Vincent's Pharmacy, the Modern Pharmacy. I mean, there was a lot of different businesses within, you know, a few blocks of each other. And it was always busy downtown.
And then, you know, the dry bridge was there, the bowling alley is in where the bookstore is now. Bridgeside Books was a bowling alley. And I set pins in there when it was a bowling alley, candlestick pins. Because, of course, there weren't any machines as there are now. Just a bunch of us guys that would get, I think, 10 cents a string, or whatever you call it when you bowl around, for picking up the pins and putting them back in place and just praying that the ball didn't come while you were down there. It was sort of a pit. Anyway.
Besides the rundown bowling alley, longtime residents have many fond memories of a compassionate and resilient community. Over the years, this village has been through many events that have shaped what the community is today. Early on, the village businesses supported the farming community that surrounded Waterbury, and it could just as easily be the other way around. In the 1830s, many of the self-sufficient farms gave way to the booming sheep farming industry. But in 1849, when the Central Vermont Railroad laid tracks through town, a lot of changes were on the horizon.
The railroad was just absolutely enormous to this town. It's hard to overstate the impact that the railroad had on, and still has, on Waterbury today.
It was a focal point to expanding an industry and gave us a lot of opportunities way ahead of communities that didn't have the railroad. Town fathers around that 1890 period really sought to bring industry to Waterbury, and the railroad was a big feature. That at one time there were 5 granite sheds in Waterbury where the product was shipped in on the railroad, cut in the granite sheds and things, and then shipped out. And some of those granite sheds employed 50 to 100 people.
There was even a connecting line, the old Mount Mansfield Electric Railroad, that left Waterbury to go to Stowe and back.
During the mid-1920s, Waterbury, as well as the rest of the state, was growing steadily. President Calvin Coolidge had restored confidence in the White House, and the nation's economy was thriving. But in November of 1927, a devastating flood hit the state. Over 1,200 bridges were destroyed, miles of roads and railroads were washed out, and countless homes and buildings were ruined. As the Winooski River reached heights higher than had ever been seen before, the storm took the lives of 20 people in Waterbury alone.
I was right in Waterbury during the flood. I was staying down there with my childhood friend by the old post office building, and at 7 o'clock, somebody knocked on the door and says, "You gotta get out of here, water is coming up." And I was carried on his back from there up to the bank, up to the top of the bank hill.
During the 27 flood, the great-grandparents were living on the second and third floor of the store next door to us. As the waters rose 4 feet an hour in at some periods during that storm, the water got up so that it was a foot above the second floor, and it was in the middle of the night. So in storage, my family had 2 shipping cases for these caskets. So my grandfather and great-grandfather, in the middle of the night with no power, got 2 of those boxes and nailed them together and got a couple of bed slats, and they loaded my mother and my uncle, who were 3 and 5 at the time, my grandparents and my great-grandparents, all loaded in the middle of the night at midnight in the dark, and shoved off the second floor porch in these 2 casket boxes, hoping that they weren't going to leak. And they paddled their way to the top of Bank Hill, which was the high point in the village.
But the Methodist Church in Waterbury, the water was 14 feet high on that church. Can't imagine it. My dad took a rowboat from the top of the hill here on Main Street, and he and his cousin Ralph Eaton rowed down the street and took people out of their second-story windows in the time of 1927.
Those who were flooded ate in the basement of the white church. Oh, I don't know, for a week or 2. Farmers couldn't get their milk to the creamery, so they took their milk cans full of milk down to the village and put it on the sidewalks for people to come get milk for food.
It was a big lesson for the people that lived here and working together, that was for sure.
I think that, people didn't spend a lot of time, they got themselves dried out, and they got themselves mopped up and cleaned up and painted and spruced up. They didn't worry too much about mold. They didn't worry about, any of that stuff. They got themselves back up and running. And, back in those days, there wasn't a lot of insulation, if anything, in the walls, and, things dried out pretty quickly. And I think that they were really focused on getting themselves back up on their feet and going again.
Starting over again was met with unwavering determination and courage. While the country was still weathering the Depression, it became evident that something needed to be done to reduce the risk of future devastating floods.
The process began and eventually ended up with the Civilian Conservation Corps coming to Waterbury and building the Waterbury Dam, which was intended truly solely as a flood control project. I mean, at the time it was designed and built in 1936 to 1938, the Waterbury Dam was the largest earth-filled dam in the world. The first elements arrive in 1934, 1935. They live in tents until they can build Camp Smith. 2,500 men eventually filled it. They had their own hospital, their own library, their own movie theaters, the fire department, police department. I mean, it was a complete, full community.
The CCC also built the swimming pool here, and they built the high school gymnasium. But the big enterprise was this dam to protect the future generations in Vermont from the kind of a disaster that just tore this place apart.
And my father used to take us over there to watch the machinery going. And a dump truck back then was only about a 3-yard truck, and here we got, nowadays we're going around with a dump truck that carries 16 yards or so. There was men everywhere. There was just 2,000 or 3,000 people working on that. It was very interesting. We used to go there every 2 or 3 weeks to see how they're going along, I guess.
That's when my husband and I were going together, and we spent a lot of our courting time sitting at one end of the dam to watch it being built, which was very interesting. They worked day and night. You see the trucks coming down through where the water is now bringing stone and dirt for the dam.
They had to buy their food, they had to buy their coal, they had to recreate in town. So it brought in enormous amounts of money to Waterbury. And this is during the Depression, at a time when money is a very, very short commodity. So the Civilian Conservation Corps really, I think in many ways, funded Waterbury at the height of the Depression.
While local businesses continued to grow through the 40s and 50s, many farmers were feeling pressure to invest in new technology.
You can't imagine if you haven't lived it. Cutting corn, we did it with a sickle. No bundles, you picked it up, put it on a wagon, and they took it down and blew it into the silo. That took a lot of our summer time until the haying started.
I can remember when Dad's schedule in the summer was to milk the cows, eat breakfast, go out with a pitchfork and turn every piece of hay over by hand so that it would dry properly. And I can remember when we got our tedder. And then Mother was out there on the tractor, late morning with a tedder, turning that hay over with a machine, and it was like, yay, we don't have to do that handwork anymore. And he used to have to drive the horse and wagon or the horse and sleigh off the hill, and made that transition to automotives. And I can remember hearing him say to people when they'd talk about the good old days, he'd say, I don't want to go back to the good old days. I don't ever want to ride behind a team of horses off this hill again.
When I was a kid, there were still guys using horses. It wasn't a whole lot. Mr. Lavery hayed with them. Andy Aber up on Loomis Hill did about all of his work. There was a guy named Cliff Parody up on Barnes Hill. I never forgot. He'd come down with a regular buckboard. And I'm not that old, but he'd come down. It was just interesting because my dad did have a car.
My dad used to talk a lot about, the changes that he had seen. And he was here when they first brought power up Blush Hill, and he was here when they added the telephone service.
I came home from grade school one time and I heard the telephone ring. I said, what? I ran in the dining room and there was a telephone hitched on the wall. Had a crank on it or something like that, and speaker out. I said, oh, we got a telephone. I'd heard about them, but we didn't have them before. And it was about 7 or 8 people would be on one line, and it'd ring a different number. If you rang somebody, you'd have a different number for each one of them.
And you'd pick up the phone and she'd answer and say, number please, and then you'd say the number you wanted. And a lot of them were parting lines, which was interesting because if you happened to pick a parting line where there was something going on, you didn't want to leave the conversation, you didn't want to let them know that you were actually listening, but some of those were pretty good.
You get to talking on the phone and you could hear if anybody was listening, because you might hear things in their house, noises that you recognized. No, they were listening to you, but that was how they found out the news.
As rural life adjusted to new lines of communication and mechanization, the downtown saw a rapid growth in tourism.
Waterbury has always been essentially a crossroads. Major routes, railroads all pass through Waterbury. So over the years it kind of grew as a tourist attraction. At one time we had the very large, beautiful and elegant Waterbury Inn downtown. And folks would come from all over New England, New York, the East Coast, literally to spend weeks at the Waterbury Inn as a resort.
The train station down here brought travelers in that ultimately ended up in the ski areas of both the Mad River Valley and Stowe. It was really sort of the hub of central Vermont in many ways.
So that helped, form the tourist industry that helped support us.
There weren't many reservation places in Stowe, and they'd bring them back. They'd transport them up to the mountain and then bring them back here.
And as a kid, I remember going down and we would carry bags from the passengers over to their conveyance. And I remember the daughters of the Von Trapps coming down in their Jeep and their dirndls. They would wheel in as the train arrived because, of course, the train would carry people up from New York.
The automobile industry boom brought a big shift to all of Waterbury's businesses and surrounding farms. Residents' views of the impacts of the interstate then and now vary dramatically. At the time of construction, these concerns were hotly debated. But there was no stopping this new connection to the outside world.
The interstate changed the entire state of Vermont. Waterbury was no different.
Yeah, the interstate came in the 50s, and I can remember late 50s. I can remember there was great consternation in Waterbury about the fact that we'd be at this juncture of the road between Montpelier and Burlington.
Yeah, I was in high school when Waterbury had that influx of population because of all the people that came to work on the interstate.
A lot of the kids that were in our class, there was 57 when we graduated, which sounds funny today. Well, a lot of them were the interstate kids that came through. Yeah, that was a big boost to us when that came along.
I remember when I had my first ride on the interstate and how much easier it made it. And to begin with, for us, we had the link to Montpelier, which was the part that opened first, and that just made things so much easier to get around. But by the same token, it's what's brought so many more people and so much more industry, and it changed Vermont so much by allowing people the ability to be able to travel here so easily.
I think having the interstate come through here and having an exit, it sort of predates me, but having that exit, a lot of the development that you see in Waterbury is because we are at that exit.
You saw a decline of commerce within the village proper because Burlington and Montpelier were now easily accessible. They didn't feel like an all-day excursion back when you had to travel out Route 2 to go to either one of them. It was a big change.
Yeah, Waterbury, I think, went through a kind of a mini depression probably in the late 1960s, 1970s. A lot of businesses that were here closed or moved away. No new businesses came in, storefronts closed. It was generally not a good time in Waterbury. Things got into disrepair. And the town was kind of, I think, sort of seeking a way to the future because yet we were the crossroads, the recreation crossroads, but there wasn't much here except the big state hospital. And of course the state hospital gave Waterbury a kind of a dark reputation for housing that facility.
Just like the impacts of the interstate, the impacts of the state hospital were more complicated and often debated. Since opening in 1891, the Vermont State Hospital was a major employer of Waterbury residents. It was expanded until it housed almost 1,400 mentally ill patients. But by the 1980s, the number of patients dropped to under 200. To make use of the unused space, state officials decided to convert it to state offices and moved many departments from Montpelier to what was called the Waterbury State Complex. Bringing in hundreds of state workers into town every day gave a much-needed boost to the village economy. This revitalization led to the attraction of much bigger businesses moving into the area.
You brought a lot more professional level jobs into the town than existed previously. And I think that was a big change in how our downtown sort of evolved and developed. And you saw more restaurants opening up, you saw little shops opening up, you saw more professional businesses.
I think the real change that I've seen in Waterbury has been going from that rural farm community to becoming an urban area with, businesses that have moved into town, and the increase in the technology and the level of jobs.
I was on the planning commission at the time when Ben and Jerry's came here. Ben and Jerry and Chico Lager approached Waterbury about building their plant here. And just like anything, you go from a sleepy little town to having a major tourist attraction here. There was some growing pains. But I think that what it really did is it made people notice that coming into this area that Waterbury existed.
Ben and Jerry's coming to Waterbury was a big deal. Of course, they'd been in Burlington. They were a small operation in Burlington. They were in a converted filling station in Burlington, but when they got big, they had to expand, and they decided to expand to Waterbury. It was the beginning of, industry in Waterbury. But when Ben & Jerry's came, it seemed like the world was beating a path to Waterbury's door. It really did seem like the beginning of a renaissance in Waterbury, and it attracted a number of very talented individuals. I think they brought a brand new flavor, if you will, forgive the pun, to Waterbury. It really did make a big difference, and it made Waterbury more of an attraction, I think, to businesses. And when people come with skills like that, they want good schools, good housing.
And then it became a destination point for tourists. It wasn't just Stowe, it wasn't just skiing. You could bring the children, and they worked very hard to create something for Waterbury, for which they didn't get much credit, that really did help the economy, the entire economy in the area. I mean, if you came to, you had to go to Ben & Jerry's.
A lot of the change that I've seen has been in the downtown area of Waterbury. There's been a huge revitalization that's occurred. Some of it has been for jobs. Vermont Coffee Roasters was a small company when we arrived here. They probably had a couple hundred employees at the most, and now they're a multinational company and still have a huge presence in Waterbury.
I think that was a real tipping point for Waterbury's eventual growth.
A lot of people with a lot of energy came and saw some possibilities in Waterbury.
And not everybody that lives in this community are Vermonters, much less native Waterbury folks. But they've embraced the spirit of what this community and other communities in Vermont have, with that they've brought some change.
And how this new generation of people have come in there and really tipped the whole place on its side, or upside down, if you will, from what it was when I was growing up a kid, is pretty darned exciting.
Just when it seemed like things couldn't be better in Waterbury, the unexpected happened. On August 29th, 2011, Tropical Storm Irene delivered levels of rain not seen since the flood of 1927. Once again, the rivers overflowed their banks with devastating effects on residents and local businesses. And once again, the community rallied together to comfort each other and rebuild their town.
What was really nice to see was the fact that, during 2011, when we experienced Irene, people rolled up their sleeves and they got dirty and they went about their business and got things fixed. And there was a lot of community involvement and outside the community involvement, because we weren't the only ones that were affected by this, but we had people from other communities come here and get dirty with us and help put families back in their homes, and didn't ask for anything but a sandwich and a thank you. And I think that that's a lot to be proud of.
The thing about Waterbury didn't skip a beat for losing all that business, and I know there were businesses that were really adversely affected, and I'm sorry about that, and we've lost business as a result. But for the most part, I think there was a wonderful spirit in Waterbury of cooperative betterment. We were going to work together. We were going to beat this thing, and it wasn't going to beat us, and that's what happened.
It's really been remarkable, and as we've found public money to invest in the community in particular projects, there's been a huge amount of private investment renovating buildings, and I think this really culminated in the whole recovery from Tropical Storm Irene, because that was a case where many buildings were damaged, and we really were at a crossroads in terms of whether the downtown area was going to survive or not. And the community really rallied and supported each other, and were able to come through the recovery and restore the buildings, get businesses back in shape, and get the economy to revive.
If ever there was an example of a town coalescing around an event, it was that event.
It may not be all that different than other communities, but to us, it's real and makes us what it is today.
If you look back at the history of Waterbury, there is an ongoing thread that seems to constantly weave its way into the stories that are shared about this little town. And that constant is community. Regardless of good times or bad, this community has always been there to help each other.
I'm very proud of this community and how it's recovered through recessions and floods and things. I think it shows a lot about its character and the people that live here.
That kind of spirit that really has made Waterbury what it is today, from all those who really went above and beyond looking for what it's necessary to make it a safe and healthy place here.
You know, I've appreciated the ability to stay here in my hometown and be a part of its growth and part of its viability. And it's kept me connected to my roots, I think, probably most of all. It's provided an excellent place for my kids to grow up. You know, it's had that sort of hometown feeling, but it's also, you know, close enough so that they could experience other things around them. And now my grandchildren.
I've always enjoyed living in Waterbury. I've always been proud to live in Waterbury.
Waterbury was a good place to be. I can't imagine a better place to grow up.
I can't really ever see myself leaving Waterbury. It becomes part of who you are.
And, you know, I just think Waterbury is a spectacular town with a wonderful bunch of folks who are willing to invest their time and energies here.
We're tasked to interview different people and ask them about, you know, their life in Waterbury, get a good viewpoint and make a documentary. It's a lot of fun. So.
It was really cool to be a part of a video instead of just kind of watching mindlessly. It was really nice to have a voice in what's going to be presented on Vermont.
In the beginning of the class, I said to the class, this is a course in Vermont history, but in addition to studying Vermont history, this course is designed to make history. And I think students themselves have made history. And it's to them that I give a lot of credit to it. Without the students, there wouldn't have been the film.
This kind of experiential learning is central to the high-impact education that we at Johnson State College offer. What you are about to see is importantly the work of our students, researching and interviewing local community members, helping make film editing decisions, and the like. Student participation in the making of these documentaries exemplifies the quality of learning experiences both within and beyond the classroom that JSC provides.
After developing the story with the students, we had to track down many historical photographs. And luckily, the Waterbury Historical Society, many individuals and businesses all contributed photographs for this project.
I guess I never really knew how much little details there were to be aware of, and you know, it was cool to experience that.
Hearing from people that have grown up there, it just really brings it home and makes it home for me. I don't know, I hope it shows people who and what Waterbury is.
It just gives you a great feeling of Vermont history and the people that made up the history. Sometimes we lose that. We look at the covered bridges or we look at the State House, but we don't really learn about the people in depth and their everyday life. And it's their everyday life that's important.
Vermont PBS, partnering with local filmmakers to bring you stories made here. For more, visit vermontpbs.org.